Wonderful. First off, if we can move to the first slide, thanks very much, Paul. And just like to welcome everybody to the what's the first event Maritime UK's had this year. My name's Ben Murray. I'm the director of Maritime UK, and it's great to sort of see you. For those of you I can see, and sort of know that the rest of you are here, and it's great to have you with us. I thought I would just briefly explain who Maritime UK are for anybody that doesn't know, and then we'll get into introducing the agenda, the topic, and the panelists. So Maritime UK, for those of you who don't know, is the collective voice for the UK's maritime industries. And we set our ambition as being to champion and enable a thriving maritime sector. And we do that by identifying the common cause, the common priorities for each of our maritime industries. And those are they that are listed there. So they're around people, innovation, regional growth, the environment, and competitiveness. And what we try and do is make sure we're all pulling in the same direction to move the sector forward against those ambitions, all of which are mapped and aligned to the UK's flagship strategy, Maritime 2050. And you can see those member organisations that make up the collective there. A number of colleagues from those member organisations are on the call on the webinar here today, and we're grateful to them for doing that. So huge thanks to everybody who's joined. We'll introduce you to them in a moment. But first, if we can move over to the next slide, we'll talk through today's agenda. So there's barely, I mean, personally, I joined Maritime UK on the Monday of the week of the EU referendum. And ever since, there's never been a conversation that's not had Brexit in it, that's not been a big focus of our work. And I think there's been plenty of time throughout those 4 and a bit years where it's been, will there be a deal, won't there be a deal? And I think some of us have become a little bit numb to some of the intricacies of those negotiations because they've been going on for so long. But obviously just before Christmas, news broke that a deal had been agreed between the EU and the UK. And there's been plenty of journalistic analysis of that. What we want to do in today's session is explain what that means for this sector in particular. And as we find ourselves as a sector working more and more closely together, our manufacturers working with our universities, working with our service providers, with our ports and so on, we thought it was important that all parts of the sector had an opportunity to understand what the deal means for the other parts of the sector, because given that we're working more closely than ever, supply chains, the ecosystems, particularly in a regional context, are there. We thought it was useful to appraise people of what it meant for each part of the sector. So that's why we've structured today in the way that we have. We'll be looking first off at what the deal means in a high level sense. We'll then be focusing on 5 areas of the deal. We'll be first of all looking at, or what the deal means for these 5 areas. We'll be looking at manufacturing. We'll then be looking at the movement of freight and people. And clearly this has been an area that's been front of the, I guess, the public consciousness on this because of the focus on borders and ferries, and that's what a lot of the public have seen. So we'll focus on that. Then we'll look at professional services. We'll then focus on education and training, and then EU programs, but specifically around, I think, the innovation programs that a number of the companies on this call and elsewhere already engage in, and we need to understand what will happen going forward. We'll then have a bit of a presentation about what happens now, because I think as much of the news media has identified, this is a first deal, it's a thin deal, and it's a starting point. So it's in all our interest to understand what the frequency of further negotiations are, what the review processes are, and how we as a collective can help shape that and influence that. So we'll look at that. And then really importantly, there's an opportunity for a lot of questions and answers. But 2 ways we'd like you to do that, either throughout the session by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or when we get to, sorry, that is the way that you'll do it, but people may be answering the questions throughout, and or come the Q&A session at 4 on the screen, I will be pulling out some specific questions and putting them to our panelists. So that's the agenda for today. I'll just introduce our panel and then we'll get stuck in. So you may have noticed a slight change to the cast list. Josh Standerwick of Maritime London was due to speak. He's had some technical problems, and the chair of Maritime London, Lord Mountevans, has very kindly stepped in to cover his section, and we'll be hearing from Lord Mountevans on professional services. we're joined by the Chamber of Shipping's Matthew Wright, who will be talking about the movement of freight and people. We're also joined by Brian Clark from British Marine, who will be talking about manufacturing. Louise Mothersole from Innovate UK will be talking about EU programs, and particularly the innovation programs that the opportunities remain for this sector to participate in. We'll then be hearing from Iain Mackinnon from the Maritime Skills Alliance on education and training, from George Riddell at EY, and from Allie Renison at the Institute of Directors. And thanks to George and Allie for joining in particular, to give a cross-sector economy-wide view. And if any of you are participants on Twitter in much of the negotiation discussion that's been happening, you'll see that both George and Allie have been very active and very present in those. And we're grateful to them for joining us to give us their thoughts on what the deal means for this sector and a broader perspective on what the deal looks like to the British economy. So that's our panel. Once again, very grateful for all of them for joining us. And I think the next thing that we should do is hear about the deal in the round. So I'm going to hand over to George just to give us a high-level overview of the deal, what's in, what's not in, and any other reflections thereafter. So over to you, George.
Thanks, Ben, and really appreciate the invitation to join today, if not the slightly unenviable task of compressing what is over 1,200 pages of legal text and several joint decisions into one slide and 10 minutes. But let's give it a go. And several of these elements colleagues will be touching on later on through the specific presentations on the different areas. I think in general, the deal has been welcomed by British businesses. Certainly many of the clients that I speak to and have been speaking to over the last 7 days or so, certainly, have welcomed the certainty that a deal has brought. But I think there's a growing realization that by leaving the single market, by leaving the customs union, there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done, and the changes in the trading relationship between the UK and the EU is only now really coming into focus. We've known for a long time now that, by virtue of pursuing something along the lines of a Canada-style free trade agreement would mean these changes. But I don't think that realization really hit until recently. 3 main areas where we've been seeing a lot of focus at the moment. I think one is around the new customs and borders procedures. Certainly, the readiness for that has been mixed across the economy. A huge number of interest as well in the new points-based immigration system that's operating here in the UK. I think from a number of different perspectives, both for long-term employees, but also with that free movement ending, the realization that, needing to have a work visa in order to travel and work and supply a service, even on a temporary basis in the EU, for many business activities is going to be needed. And that these requirements do differ between different member states, and there's not a unified system when looking to operate in the EU going forward. In terms of the process, the agreement has been provisionally ratified on the EU side and fully ratified on the UK side. The European Parliament has until the end of February under the current arrangements in order to vote up or down on the deal. But there have been indications that they will be looking to seek changes to the agreement and potentially pushing that vote back until March. So on the EU side, there is still some uncertainty around when, in fact, this deal is going to fully enter into force, but at least until the end of February, we have certainty that these arrangements will hold. In terms of what's included and not included in the deal, sort of a quick overview in the slide there. I think for many companies, the biggest benefits of a deal are the tariff-free, quota-free provisions. that the deal allows for, although subject to the rules of origin and being able to satisfy those rules of origin in order to claim the preferential tariff access. There's been some easements announced for the next 12 months on the rules of origin front, and certainly that will be welcome for many companies, although the work really starts now to make sure that you're ready for the end of that period when the full rules of origin requirements will come in. Another area that was welcomed by business, I think, was government procurement. For many months, we'd heard from the UK side that government procurement and mutual access was not going to be part of the deal. However, when the final deal emerged, that was quite a welcome announcement and not reverting back to WTO rules on the government procurement front. It also allowed for a trade agreement with Turkey because of the customs union. The UK could not have signed a standalone deal with Turkey without having resolved the UK and EU's relationship. So certainly for many supply chains and manufacturers that operate across the UK, EU and Turkey, having a deal not only was good for their European supply chains, but also enabled those Turkish ones to continue as well as, additional provisions for road haulage and air transport, which I understand not necessarily of relevance to this audience, but certainly for other transport and logistics sectors, those additional access and, particularly on road haulage, not needing ECMT permits, some derogations and easements around international driving license as well has been greatly welcomed. In terms of what's not included, and again, I'll go through these quite quickly, I think services trade in FTAs is an area where there's just not as much integration, and also the bifurcation of the market is going to become increasingly apparent over the coming weeks and months. Unlike for goods, as soon as you get it past that customs border, it enters into free circulation and you can transport the product and sell it wherever you want within the EU. The same just simply is not true for services. And I'm talking, professional services, business services, creative services. Each member state has its own restrictions and market access conditions, and British exporters are going to need to manage that going forward. There was also no actual recognition of professional qualifications that was granted, and I know we'll be talking about that a bit later, but only a framework along the Canada-style model was set up. Then on sanitary and phytosanitary checks, we've seen in the news, even today, from the Scottish Seafood Association, the impact that the relative light touch approach in the FTA to SPS checks and inspections has taken is already hitting UK exporters. And that was an area that I think is going to continue to play quite a big role. And then finally, there are very few restraints that either side has put on the use of trade remedies going forward. So these are possible tariffs coming about as a result of unfair subsidization or competition between the UK and the EU. One of the reasons I think these will become particularly relevant is that they're easier to use than many of the dispute mechanisms that are contained in other parts of the agreement. So I fear they will become a default or proxy means of settling disputes between the UK and EU rather than triggering some of those more complex dispute provisions that are in the agreement. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope useful context in terms of what's in and out of the deal as it currently stands.
Great, thanks very much, George. And as you say, we'll pick up a number of those topics later parts of the presentation. But I know we'll be a number of colleagues on the call will be keen to ask some questions of you perhaps as we go. So just a reminder, do use the Q&A function at the bottom if you've got any questions for any of our panelists. Thanks, George. Moving to the next slide, we're now starting to get into different parts of the sector in terms of different functions of what the deal means. So I'd like to hand over to Brian Clark from British Marine.
Well, thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New to you. I don't actually have any slides with me, but what I thought I would do before I start is just give a little bit of a background to British Marine and our industry. So we're the trade association for the leisure, super yacht and small commercial marine sector. So we represent a whole variety of different businesses, from the OEMs, their entire supply chain, all the way through to leisure facilities such as marinas and boatyards, as well as those operating passenger boat trips, as well as inland and coastal holiday hire. We've got about 5,800 businesses within our membership and within the industry, should I say, employing around 38,000 people. Now, those sort of nearly 6,000 businesses, the vast majority of them are at the micro to small end of the spectrum. I think we've only got about 200 or so businesses that would be classified as medium to large. So we really are talking about representing a very sort of small business, individual business sector. However, collectively, they do generate an annual revenue of £4 billion, of which 1.5 billion is export generated. So we are a strong exporting industry. So much so that 3/4 of our export turnover is derived from exporting products to the European Union. The remaining sort of 25% is then split broadly 50-50 between the US and then the rest of the world. So our ongoing relationship with the European Union is critical, and that's why after months of uncertainty, British Marine support and value the agreement that has been made between the EU and the UK. We are still digesting, as I'm sure many other sectors are, the full detail of the agreement. But I think, as George said, one of the primary areas of interest to us is that of rules of origin. So many of the products that are manufactured in the UK, of course, bring in raw materials from around the world. So we're making sure that those non-originated material parts can come into the UK, can then be accumulated together as part of a single product, and then sold to European customers, hopefully without facing any tariffs. Now, our understanding, looking at the regulations and the guidance, so for example, for yacht manufacturing, the max non on the rules of engagement is 40%. So as long as the products within that recreational craft that's manufactured is less than 40%, then it wouldn't hit the WTO tariffs that would potentially be applied. If that was the case, fortunately for us, to a degree, the WTO tariffs for many of our products are relatively low. For example, a lot of leisure crafts are either 1.7%, rising to about 2.7%. So in actual fact, one of the biggest implications for our industry wouldn't necessarily just be the tariffs, it would actually be the exchange rates that the UK has between ourselves and the rest of our European counterparts. So that's something that we would need to, and our manufacturers would need to take into account. The issues, I suppose, the issues of the rules of origin also then could potentially drive more reshoring of manufacturing and of products. So some of our manufacturers, larger parts of their vessels are manufactured, say, in China or in the Far East, and then brought over and then assembled. The rest of the vessel is assembled in the UK. So it may well drive reshoring of certain products if they wish to benefit from the free trade agreement. And just in terms of people and resourcing, we mentioned the 38,000 people that are working within our industry. You know, it is an industry that does rely on overseas skill and labour. However, that does open opportunities to drive skill and or skills and diversification of roles within the existing UK workforce to drive growth in recruitment within our industry. As I say, we're still looking at all the ramifications of the agreement. These are the ones in the course of the last week that we've managed to identify and look at as a priority. But I say we are very much engaging with government through Maritime UK as well, to make sure that any areas that do and will continue to affect our industry going forward will be addressed. And I'll hand back to Ben.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. And I think lots of us are in a similar position where there's, I think George said at the start, there's 1,200 pages. It's about going through and seeing what those immediate flags are and concerns. But it doesn't sound like, at least within the deal, that there's huge issues at the moment. That a lot of the concerns are things such as currency, which is necessarily a function of the deal so much. But we'll perhaps get into some questions as we go. So thanks very much, Brian, for that. If we move on to the next area of analysis now, we're going to be handing over to Matthew Wright from the Chamber of Shipping to be talking about the movement of freight and people and what the deal says and means for that part of the sector. So Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Unfortunately, I was not able to be as concise as George, so I've got, I think, 4 slides today. So I'm going to have to do my Professor Whitty next slide impression. So next slide, please. Thank you very much. So what does the deal mean for maritime in our context of the Chamber of Shipping? As representatives of the UK ship owners, what does it mean for us? Really, the fundamentals are on this slide. A deal is better than a no deal. We were always confident at the Chamber that a deal would be achieved. The problem with much of the debate is what is a deal and what is a deal and what is entailing. And that was always the thing that concerned us. Again, this deal is fairly limited, as many people have spoken about already, and is often portrayed in the public media. But it does address many of the fundamentals that we were mostly concerned about. So, as George also mentioned, there was no introduction of tariffs or quotas, which obviously we clearly welcome for an industry like shipping, which is dependent on volumes of trade being carried. Clearly, the introduction on tariffs and quotas put those volumes at some form of risk. We were never ones for highlighting and scaremongering on what that might mean, but there was clearly some potential risk there in the introduction of tariffs and quotas. And clearly, the maintenance of tariff and quota-free trade between the UK and the rest of the EU is clearly welcome and going to maintain volumes for the foreseeable future. The other principle which we were very much confident would be agreed was the continued liberal principle of international maritime services. So this was the commitment on both sides that they would respect essentially OECD principles on maritime trade, that international transport operating within those jurisdictions would be treated no different than any other domestic operator. So if a EU shipping company was to come into a UK port, they'd be treated just the same as a UK operator and vice versa. And clearly this was something which was a fundamental ask of the Chamber of Shipping. It was always going to be, we were confident that it was going to be included, and hence obviously we are pleased that it was. And finally, just going back to my original point about what the actual deal was and what it's going to do. Our expectations, while we were confident a deal would be achieved, we had limited expectations of the extent the deal would deal with detail. And we wanted at least a structure for continued dialogue for future relations between the EU and UK on a trade context. So what would be the governance architecture so that UK and EU can govern trade in the future, how it can look at continuing to improve trading administration between the two jurisdictions. And again, how this was going to be established within a trade agreement was something we were quite keen on seeing. And again, through what we'll discuss later in the trade specialised committees and various other forums, we believe there is suitable forums for industry engagement, both within the UK and the EU, so that those issues can be addressed. Next slide, please, Paul. So I'll deal with freight and passengers separately. Just to be clear from the outset, what was agreed makes no difference at all to what many of our members and the wider shipping industry and logistics industry have to do in respect to the changes that were anticipated on the 1st of January this year. There is no effect on that at all in a sort of shipping administrative context. What we are grateful for is that the agreement uses sort of common and very developed language and ideals developed within the World Customs Organization. Again, they weren't reinventing the wheel, they're using and adapting existing precedents and examples in international trade. So that was clearly welcomed. As I mentioned previously, the establishment or the proposed establishment of trade specialised committees, there are several of these, I think 7 or 8, although I might be corrected later. But clearly for the purpose of this presentation, the one on customs cooperation and the rules of origin is going to be of most interest to our members and the shipping industry. Obviously, rules of origin will be of interest for Brian previously, but for customs cooperation, there will be various aspects of how customs are coordinated and freight is managed in the future, which we will be clearly wanting to engage within that trade specialised committee upon. As an example, though, of the problems that are going to be highlighted and that have been outlined in the trade agreement is the 2 single windows. The irony of that was should not be lost on all of us, that obviously many of our members had always hoped for this elixir of simplification in having 1 single window to manage customs flows in both directions, and now we will have single windows for UK imports and EU imports separately. And clearly that's a perfect example of the duplication in bureaucracy and controls and in work that our members are going to have to commit to in the near future. Just as a few other examples of things which maybe hadn't really previously been considered was the loss of authorised regular shipping services status. This is a carve-out that was created for EU membership. So even in the EU, we were grateful for this particular provision. The loss of it, which means that ships which call on a regular basis between the EU and UK, for example, between Dover and Calais, have to make repeated declarations of their intent. There are some sort of block bookings, shall we simplify it in that way, to simplify it, but it will still mean additional bureaucracy on a regular basis, maybe on a monthly basis or something like that, which is a further cost to our members. And again, we would look to see how that can maybe be simplified in the future. And again, just reiterating a bit what which George said in terms of haulage permits and things. Again, many of the provisions, many of the concerns prior to the deal being announced was about the availability of haulage industries to continue to operate effectively in the EU and the UK. And the agreement clearly assists with that, even though it's not as liberal as was before. Next slide, please. On passengers, there's very limited provisions, really. There's not much to say. Clearly, the headline would be the visa-free travel. Again, another aspect of the deal which was very much expected. It wasn't a particular surprise that that was agreed. And again, for our members, and especially given the context of COVID and looking to encourage passenger numbers in the near to medium term, visa-free travel is clearly another thing that can contribute to that. And if it hadn't been that way, would have been another sort of issue and problem for encouraging passenger demand post-COVID. So obviously that was clearly welcomed. Aside from that, there really isn't many other special treatments for respective nationals in travelling to and from the UK on maritime transportation. There is obviously the provisions on driving permits and on passports. You obviously need to have 6 months in your passport and things now. These things were, again, pretty much established prior to the agreement. So when they were agreed, that's great, but it doesn't create additional benefits necessarily. One of the other interesting things which we've noticed is, again, as an example of diversion, is there was no equivalent in terms of maritime consideration for PNR and API data. This is quite a specific thing which might not be too relevant for many of the people on this call. But it just shows how maritime maybe hasn't been considered to the same extent as aviation. Aviation industry, this was a massive, massive issue for them. The UK government agreed to the advanced passenger information regulation within the EU when we were still members of the EU, and agreed that that was going to be brought across into UK law after we left. And the effects of that directive are going to be felt in the UK in Q2 and then in Q4 going into Q1 2022. So over the next year, the effects of this will be felt in the UK. But again, in the trade agreement, there is certainly provision for better engagement between the UK and the EU on managing that data flow between the two jurisdictions. In maritime, that is not provided yet. Clearly, because the systems are not as mature in aviation, but when we develop those systems on both the UK and EU sides over the next 12 to 18 months, this is clearly going to be something which will be of interest to the maritime passenger shipping community in getting a better dialogue on how that data can be managed. And hopefully in the future, an addendum to the trade agreement can be agreed, which is similar to that on aviation. Again, duty-free not covered. The provisions and amounts that the UK government stated as being permitted for passengers to bring into the UK prior Christmas and in Q4 last year remain. Next slide, please. So on to the future and a bit of a conclusion, really. As I highlighted earlier, the trade specialised committees are going to be crucial going forward. One of the challenges we've faced over the last 2-3 years has been a real lack of transparency and earnest engagement with DIT in contributing to their work and to the work of DEXU in establishing what the real needs for the maritime and the shipping industry are and how the government can advocate for them. I would certainly want to see the TSCs being far more inclusive of our industry going forward, being far more receptive to our wishes and our asks, and looking to try and achieve a better outcome for those demands when the detail is being developed between the UK and the EU, but obviously in the future trade agreements as well. We have to bear in mind that the other trade agreements agreed with other third countries are to some extent generally rollover contracts which will be reviewed in 3 to 4 years. Therefore, the continued work on this basis in terms of reassessing the industry demands vis-a-vis other countries' commitments is an ongoing piece of work which the UK government would certainly benefit, I think, from a closer engagement with ourselves. The other items are generally domestic and internally facing. So on UK Future Borders and the Future Freight Programme, these two bodies of work being led by DFT and the Cabinet Office stroke HMRC respectively are clearly going to be hugely significant in the next 12 months. Much of what we are looking at in terms of the trade agreement, you have to look at it in terms of the context of how trade and how industry is operating already. And if the UK government is wanting to reshape future borders and look at how freight is managed slightly different in the future, then these things have to work on the basis of the trade agreement and filter into the wider investments and development that the UK government wants to achieve. So those two programmes of keen interest for the UK in the next 12 to 18 months. Other issues which are key to monitoring. First, level playing field, which I imagine is going to be discussed later by other speakers. But we've already started seeing examples only in the first week since the changes were brought in on customs, that there are already identified differences in consistency between ports, both in the UK and in the EU, in terms of how customs are applied. This has been a long-term concern of the Chamber, in that the effect that certain authorities will place in those ports for the same commodity but in different ports will clearly create advantage and disadvantages for those different routes and for those different actors operating through those trade corridors. This is clearly something which wasn't so prominent before, and needs to be monitored closely, because there could be serious disadvantages to certain regions and certain actors within the supply chain if those inconsistencies continue to create an unlevel playing field. And also, what will also be interesting in the next few months is seeing how the changes may change the market. So we're already seeing, for example, increased maritime services from the EU mainland into the island of Ireland, direct and diverting away from the land bridge. This is something that was maturing a little bit in Q4, and it's going to be interesting to see how that develops as we go into 2021. I think also modal shift and other considerations have to come into effect there. And when you consider the fact that there's intense pressure upon the wider supply chain network at the moment, as evidenced by the news headlines in Felixstowe and Southampton and elsewhere, you can see that it's going to be a very interesting few months to see how the changes may manifest themselves in the wider operations of the shipping economy. And finally, such policies like free ports, how are they going to be factored in? How are they going to mature in 2021? And how are they going to relate to the trade agreement? What aspects of the trade agreement are they going to be relevant to? And what effects might they have vis-a-vis the trade agreement and the other future industrial policies that the UK government wants to introduce in terms of changing the way that freight and trade is conducted? So it's going to be a fascinating year ahead, and yeah, we look forward to engaging with the rest of the Maritime UK community on it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Matthew. Very detailed. I've got some of my own questions here for you at the end as well, but I can see questions coming. So keep that going, folks, and we'll answer those now, and if there's any left, we'll answer them at the end. So thanks very much. On to the next area of focus. Just before I introduce Lord Mountevans, just a note to the panelists. I'm going to ask everybody after this to give both their, having analysed the deal in the way that they have, what they see as the biggest challenge their part of the sector faces, but also what the biggest opportunity might be, because the Prime Minister arrives on our television screens and talks about the opportunities that we now have to seize, and it'd be useful to get to the substance of what each of you think that might be in a maritime context. So we'll come to that in a moment too. But for now, I'll hand over to Lord Mountevans to talk to us about the impact of the deal and what it means for the professional services part of our sector.
Thank you very much, and a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm sorry that Joss had some technical problems. I'll do my level best to match his traditional high standards on these occasions. So turning now to the professional business services, as you know, the UK leads the world in the provision of professional services in the maritime sectors. This is based on long-term history of expertise and capacity, and the sector probably delivers around 25% of the total market share worldwide. It's dominant in shipbroking, in marine insurance, maritime law, and very, very influential, I would say really dominant in education as well, university education, and indeed, tickets, British certificates for seafarers are very highly prized too. The sector employs over 10,000 people and contributes in the region of £4.5 billion GVA annually to the UK economy. Furthermore, the foundation of our professional services supports the growth of the wider maritime sector. And we're very privileged that we interact with really all the sectors in UK maritime and try to support them, wherever we can. So we have quite a central position, even though we're far from the largest. The maritime professional services sector has been remarkably resilient since 2016, when the referendum, if you remember, took place. And some 80%, despite the fact that 80% of our income is derived from exports, our market share has largely remained intact during this period. In the immediate term, the maritime professional business services are not greatly impacted by the deal. The broking of physical trades is unregulated, as I think you know. Maritime law and arbitration is largely governed by international convention. Marine insurers and, of course, Lloyd's Market have made their contingency plans and opened EU-based subsidiaries. However, no matter how resilient our sector is, our ongoing strength is linked closely to the wider strength and stability of our wider financial and professional business services. And we have witnessed, you will have seen some exit of capital from the UK markets. The FT reported on Monday that £6 billion of share dealing was taken off the stock exchange on the first day of trading in this new year. There remains a great level of uncertainty, for example, the lack of clarity regarding the status of UK clearing houses, that which is affecting the UK's position in derivatives trading, which is a significant sector also, not just in commodities, but also for the UK's world-beating shipbroking houses. So this is something we will, be watching very carefully. While I welcome the news that talks have already begun to reach an agreement on equivalence by March this year, we seem to be hearing a lot about an MOU. And I know from what George said earlier on that, professional services and so on be trade agreements. It's not unusual that, but the government must act fast and decisively to provide the certainty needed by this sector. And I'd also add to that the matter of mutual recognition of qualifications, because we have a tremendous number of professionals here, industry-leading professionals in London and the UK. They need to be able to, if they want to go work abroad or whatever, it's important that they should be allowed to do that. And interestingly enough, I would say to you all that quite a lot of these professional qualifications are actually set by British or international bodies based in Britain. So really, I don't feel this should be a huge issue, to gain recognition on a lot of these qualifications. At a time of increasing sort of time like this, it's very, very important that we manage to grow tax receipts. We have to pay back a great deal of debt because of the COVID emergency, and we can't afford to damage the golden goose, if you like, that lays the golden egg, which is the UK's professional and financial business services. They're the jewel in the UK's economic crown. But over the years, the city has been presented with numerous challenges, and history has demonstrated that adversity drives innovation and new ways of thinking. I was actually Lord Mayor of London the year that we had the referendum. And, within days, I was, in the States and all over the world, and I was grilled on this. But, Britain has faced all sorts of massive challenges in the past. And I think that, rather like the Thatcher Revolution, I think what we'll see is a change of gear here in the UK. I think this is something that we actually quite need. Although I was very much, on a risk basis in favour of remaining, and we'll all have to stop talking about how we would have felt. But, we have become quite sort of comfortable working within a EU context. We've really got to go out there now and hit the ball, and that's going to be an important challenge for us all. But this city, the ability to adapt and take advantage of new opportunities ensures the UK's competitive advantage. In the recent past, this can be evidenced by a number of things. The city has a remarkable ability to come up with new products when they're needed. For example, the remarkable increase in renminbi trading transacted in London. And also before that, the growth of Islamic finance, where London is a leading centre for that. The rise of London and the UK as a fintech hub, where it's now a world leader from really nothing in probably 10 years or so. And in the marine context, the rise of insurtech solutions, which have been central to the market's continued ability to operate under the current period of intense change. I'd also add to that green finance, where tremendous effort is going into, from the City of London and the Treasury into growing Britain as a home and a place to transact green finance. In terms of opportunities for the market, there are many, and while they may not be directly correlated with the ability to diverge greatly from the EU regulations, we must take advantage of the political capital created by Brexit. Ensuring the UK shipping industry and consequently UK-based professional maritime services can take advantage of the prevailing trends within the market. The imperative for the shipping industry to incrementally reduce its greenhouse gas emissions has the potential fundamentally to change the dynamics of our industry. And it will be the market's ability to capitalize on the need for the sector to decarbonize and support the industry through the raft of international, national, and commercial regulation that is being introduced as a consequence that will define our future success. And to the extent that we can grasp this important opportunity, the financial and professional business services will follow, for example, green finance, which I mentioned. In the long term, the incremental regulatory advantages and disadvantages that we may see introduced in the coming months and years as a result of Brexit will pale into insignificance by comparison with this central challenge of our time, as far as maritime goes, well, and indeed the wider world. The scale of the investment required to successfully hit the IMO 2030 and 50 targets, even with conservative estimates, is staggering. This will not only facilitate consolidation, but a new form of owner with a corporate model that will be able to attract a mix of capital required to invest in transitional to net zero tonnage. With our strong regulatory framework, asset management expertise, and our unparalleled services sector, these, if you like, new owners are the big prize for the UK. And we must focus on how we can attract capital to underpin growth in our commercial management base. Furthermore, the maritime professional services are already demonstrating how technology to support stakeholders through the increasingly onerous regulatory landscape. We must build on this success and take a proactive approach to finding and providing solutions for the market. I would say on a personal note that I think a key thing actually, and it's absolutely back to basics, but I think we need to polish up our sales techniques. Very often I find traveling around the world, people saying, the British have great products, we like dealing with you very much, we don't see you here often enough. So I think our sales techniques, we can polish them up. And also I would say part of that, if you like, but I think if any of our members here today are recruiting, do put a value on languages. There's no reason, I don't think enough emphasis put on them in the schools. It's something I talk about in Parliament from time to time. We really need to focus on languages. Latin America, an enormous market, they like the Brits, but they all speak English at a certain level. But when you're getting into the nitty-gritty of contracts and the hard part of selling, you need to be able to speak Spanish and or Portuguese. But to conclude, Ben will be looking at me in a moment, while we cannot ignore the potential consequences of Brexit on financial services, from a maritime perspective, we can achieve these two objectives. And I have no doubt that the future actually will be a bright one for our professional business services. Continuing. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks very much, Geoffrey. That was it was good to hear the positivity and the optimism in there. I think a number of questions are coming in from folks now. So if we answer those, we can. I know the services area is one that a lot of people in advance submitted questions around as well. So I'm sure when we get to the latter stages of it, we can call on other panel members as well to give their thoughts on where things stand. But thanks very much for that assessment, Geoffrey. If we move on to the next slide, I think, as Geoffrey mentioned, this is an area that the UK prides itself on, and it's right to think of this as an export as well as something that we do in this country to invest in our people and our workforce. So it's a really important area for us to analyse. So I'm going to hand over to Iain Mackinnon of the Maritime Skills Alliance. Iain.
Right, thank you very much, Ben. Can I have the next slide, Paul? Thank you. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm very happy to talk about exports as well. I'm a commissioner with the new Maritime Skills Commission and in the lead on maritime skills exports. I've not chosen to talk about that on the slides, but if you want to pick that up in questions, very happy to do that. Both George and Geoffrey have talked about recognition of professional qualifications, and that'll be the main thing that I want to talk about. Ending of free movement of labour is very clear as an impact of Brexit. Home Secretary was very keen to trumpet that as one of the big gains as she sees it. But there's clearly implications for lots of businesses right across the sector. And I've got one slide right at the end to talk about the Erasmus programme and its replacement, because that's had quite a bit of coverage. Next slide, Paul. I've got the reason for using slides is that I've got a link in this, and I'm presuming, Ben, that you'll either be circulating the slides or sticking them on the website or both subsequently, and that's the point of providing the links. Recognition of professional qualifications. For most people, there'll be no immediate change. if you're already working in Europe, in the EU27 EEA area, and you've got an existing approval, then that's fine, you can carry on. There's different rules for different types of professions. There's particular difficulties here, and there's particular new rules for seafarers, sailors, as EU calls them, so it translates into lots of different languages. And I'll cover those each separately. Next slide, Paul. So the first bit is, and as Matthew was emphasising, different rules for different countries. Instead of working on a single basis for the whole of the EU, separate rules with each of the different countries in which you work or might work, even for short-term and occasional trips. And there's a database conveniently provided to help you with this. Next slide, Paul. Actually, a nice, simple, straightforward database. Essentially 3 boxes you fill in. Where did you get your qualification? Where do you want to work? And what profession do you want to work in? So I found a nice, easy example. I've chosen to make myself a naval architect and to work in Malta, because it's got to be warmer there than it is here. Malta doesn't require, doesn't regulate naval architects, and there's no problem. So that's the box in green at the bottom. No problem at all. All this is available on what the EU rather poetically calls its Reg Prof database, and that's the link at the bottom. However, if I'd chosen to go to Spain instead of Malta, next slide, Paul. You see there in the bottom corner, it says, yes, naval architecture is a regulated profession in Spain, and you need to apply to the INO, who will tell you what you need to do about it. As it happens, the INO's website is in Spanish. I'm guessing that if you want to work as a naval architect in Spain, you either speak Spanish or you've teamed up with a company that does. That's an example of the new requirements over and above what we used to have last year, where there'll be further demands on companies working within the EEA. Next slide, please. Sorry, just before I go on, but leave the slide there, Paul, it's fine. What I was talking about there was regulated professions. There are some other professions which are not regulated, but where people are reliant on qualifications and we still need other people to accept them. And a nice example of that, yesterday at Maritime UK's People in Skills Forum, of which I'm secretary, RYA qualifications, Royal Yachting Association, based in the UK, an example of what Geoffrey was talking about. Qualifications used right across the world, based here on in Southampton, Hamble. But some countries are not accepting RYA qualifications. Nothing to do with regulations, they've just chosen not to, at least in the short term. It might be teething troubles, it might be a longer term issue, not sure. But during the meeting yesterday, Richard Falk from the RYA took several emails from people in Spain saying that yacht clubs and so on were not accepting RYA qualifications. Maybe they'll do that next week, maybe they'll do it next month and it'll get sorted, but not sorted just at the moment. For seafarers, this is the statement that the MCA has had up for about 18 months. They refreshed it on New Year's Eve just to reassure people that this remains the case. If you've got existing qualifications, you're fine. Existing approvals, you're fine. The key bit is the last paragraph. The government's working with the EU and Norway and Iceland. Needn't worry too much about Liechtenstein as it's landlocked. Working with those countries to be sure that they will continue to accept our certificates, our COCs. In yesterday's meeting, the MCA's advice was that a number of EU countries are applying to EMSA for permission, saying that they will, not permission, informing EMSA that they will continue to accept UK COCs. Not yet a complete list. They're not yet able to publicise that list, but hope to do so very shortly. They're not expecting a problem, but it's not yet sorted. Next slide, Paul. Immigration. removal of freedom of movements. We're moving to a new points-based, to a new points-based immigration scheme. Quite complex, and I'm certainly not going to try and summarize it in one slide or more. The core change, if you like, is that where in the past you have had to use a sponsor license to recruit people from outside the EEA, you now need to do that recruiting people from inside the EEA, obviously excluding the Republic of Ireland. There's lots of layers of complexity. I see there's several colleagues from the Workboat Association on the call. There's a more complex set of issues for people who are popping into UK waters for a short period and vice versa. Short-term movements, particularly where they don't involve setting foot on UK land, I think are not yet settled, but if that's an issue for you, I think colleagues from the Workboat Association are more up to date with that than I am. For me, there's two sets of issues here around immigration. One is managing short-term change. A series of things there. I mean, if you employ people who are EU citizens, they need to apply for settled status, and they've got to do that by the end of June. That's going to get you into difficulties if you don't do that, if they don't do that. So there's some short, and there's people getting their heads round the new rules about recruiting. Longer term, when all that's settled down, the government's clearly hoping that it will tilt the balance a bit. I think it is tilting the balance. It's not about replacing all foreign workers with people from the UK, and that, I mean, there's no scope to do that in the maritime sector. It can't be done. The PwC report that Maritime London did 2 years ago, I think it was, said that maybe 25% of people working in the professional services sector in the UK are from outside the UK. And if you look at the shipping sector, only 40% of our officers are Brits, only 20% of our Brits. So that we can't do a straight replacement, but the government's hoping we'll shift the balance. And instead of people as an instinct saying, well, we'll just get people in from overseas, we'll fly in a pole, to say, well, maybe we should be doing some growing our own. And an example of that from one of Brian's members, Princess Yachts. They worked out that 11% of their workforce were Poles, carpenters, for example, and they very much want to hang on to them because they're talented people. And the last thing you want is short-term disruption in a company like Princess. But they're saying for the longer term, probably it's going to get a bit harder to recruit people from the EU. Therefore, we need to invest more in doing our own thing. Apprenticeships are their chosen route. Perhaps rather against the grain, and despite all the other difficulties in 2020, they've taken on their largest number of apprentices ever. They took on 66 apprentices in the autumn. So that's an example, I think, of a company that's saying, we don't need to do something as of January, but things are changing and there are opportunities there. Next slide, Paul. And then because this has been in the press and because I'm personally interested in it and trying to move things on a bit, I thought this was worth a mention. Some of you will know that there's a big EU programme, the Erasmus programme, that's been running 20 odd years. UK's been one of the largest participants, primarily about exchanges, our people going to European countries and vice versa. Lots of people want to come here, not least because we speak English and they can pick up English alongside other things, polish their English rather, alongside other things. The government has said very clearly, the UK will not be participating in the new enlarged Erasmus programme that's starting this year, but it will set up instead the Turing scheme. £100 million, 35,000 students. There's not much more information available yet beyond what's been announced, the initial announcement that's on the Department for Education website. It doesn't look as though there'll be an exchange element to it. So we'll be saying to organisations overseas, please will you take some of our bright young people and give them an interesting opportunity. but we're not saying back at the moment, unless the government changes its mind, and in exchange we'll take some of your bright young people and show them some stuff that's going on in Britain. One of the big changes that obviously the government's really keen on is that it will have a worldwide scope. Quite what that means, not sure. As it happens, Erasmus did touch maybe not just Europe, but also about 60 countries altogether. I imagine the government's particularly keen on Far East states, Middle East, maybe Commonwealth countries, but none of that settled yet. At the Maritime UK's People and Skills Forum yesterday, I suggested to colleagues that we should grab this. I see lots of opportunity for us to use this. We probably need to work with them to shape it, to make it a bit better than that summary I've just given you, I hope. But there's an opportunity there, and colleagues were keen that we should grab it. So I will be talking to the Department for Education on behalf of Maritime UK to say, hello, we want to be part of this, and we want to be part of shaping it. And that's me. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks very much, Iain. Lots of questions coming in there, folks. So we'll get through Louise's presentation and then Allie's, and then we'll come to those questions. Of course, if panelists want to respond to any of those questions in the meantime, please do so. Brian, I know that you've got to leave any moment. So just 5 minutes before you go, we'll bring you up the agenda in terms of that question I was pondering earlier. From what you've seen, what's the most immediate or the most significant challenge you see for your part of the sector from the deal, and any opportunity in particular you think that the deal presents to your part of the sector, and then we'll let you.
Sure. It's probably a bit of a cop-out answer that I'm going to give, but it's probably both an opportunity and a challenge, and it's the point I raised at the beginning in my introduction with regards to our international trade, with only a quarter of our overseas trade derived from selling our products to the rest of the world. I think there's a massive opportunity for us to perhaps maintain the existing trade that we have with our European colleagues, but also then through various trade agreements enhance the amount of product that we're selling around the world. I think, however, that is the challenge, is that traditionally Europe has been our favoured market, and perhaps we need the support from DIT and government to make sure that we can break into those markets that are wanting our products. So yeah, an opportunity and a challenge at the same time.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. If we can move on to the next presentation, Paul, please. We've got Louise, I hope.
Hi there. Yes.
Louise, over to you.
Hi. Thanks for this. You'll see that my email address is there. Please take a note of it if ever you want to get in touch with me. I am the national contact point for transport for all of the EU framework programmes. Horizon 2020 is the current one, it's just finishing. Horizon Europe, I'm going to talk about. There's no point being a national contact point without being able to be contacted. So please do take a note of the email address and get in touch if you need any information after this presentation. So next slide, please. So some of this is background stuff. It will be old hat to some of you. I'm not going to read every bullet because I realise I'm last on the agenda. We're possibly running out of time, or rather we want more time for the questions and the discussion, I think. So European framework programmes, they've been going for quite a long time. They last about 7 years. They are aligned with the EU's budgetary cycle. So the MFF, multi-annual financial framework. Horizon 2020 was an 80 billion research programme, of which the UK was fully eligible to be part of as a member state. Horizon Europe is its successor, and I want to tell you a little bit more about that. It has a budget of 95.5 billion, and the UK has agreed to associate to it. What does that mean? Next slide. Okay, so as well as the organisations that you'd expect to be able to participate in these framework programmes, i.e. the member states, there is a whole host of other associate countries. So these might be things that you'd expect to see, you know, yes, Norway, Switzerland, they're in there, they are associate countries. However, so are Israel, Tunisia, Albania. So there's a lot of other associated countries of which the UK has said that we will be one. Associate countries participate in the research programmes as if they are a member state. They have the same access and eligibility. Eligibility means that most of these calls for proposals that have come out of this, because it is a competitive system to access that 95 billion euro, a lot of that will be, you need to be part of a consortium. You need to be in a team with at least 2 other organisations from 2 different eligible countries. UK counts as one of those eligible now. We always did previously as a member state. We now will continue to be one of those eligible as an associate country. That means we'll also get our funding directly from the EU, because the UK government will pay our fee to join this competition. So a lump sum will be transferred across so that UK organisations participate on a level playing field with other member states and other associate countries. Next slide. This one, if you get this slide, if you get the slide deck and it's live, all of these have a source link to where you can see these official statements. So if you say, well, that's all very well for the UK government to say that, what does the EU say? What is the Commission saying, or what is the Member of Parliament or the Minister for Science saying? You can see on this slide when you get it, they've all officially stated this out loud and they're all agreeing. Next slide, please. So what is Horizon Europe? This is its structure. This is the 95.5 billion euro. You'll see that on the left-hand side of this, Pillar 1 is all about the excellent science. This is primarily the academic research side of things. So this is what will certainly interest mostly the university sector within the UK. The Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions is, if you like, the postgraduate version of Erasmus. Yes, the UK is still going to be fully participating in all of that. So the postgrad part of it is still available to all UK academics. The middle pillar, however, is, I think, the thing that's going to interest the industrial side of our community, including the research organisations or the insurance organisations, the whole lot. And you'll see that there's a number of clusters there. One middle one, climate, energy and mobility cluster, is something that would interest us, I hope. If you, next slide, I'll show you what that contains. So there's these things called destinations. So this is a 15 billion, that's a billion with a B, euro research program. It does last for 7 years. So it's about 2 billions a year. And you'll see that numbers 5 and 6, next slide. Numbers 5 and 6 are the clean and competitive solutions for all transport modes. So this is about decarbonisation of transport. And then the safe, resilient transport and smart mobility services for passengers and goods is about, as it clearly states, the safety and the mobility services. So next slide. There is a particular initiative called the Zero Emission Waterborne Transport, which is a co-programmed partnership. This is managed by a Dutchman, Jaap Gebrad, who from Sea Europe, who's also the Secretariat for the Waterborne Technology Platform. And basically this means that if you get involved in this partnership, then you get a say in what the calls for proposals that come out of the European Commission are. So you get to be the person that sets the exam question as well as the one that answers it. You don't get to mark your own homework, but you do get to be on 2 sides of that triangle. And of course, you get to be in the room with other people who are also doing the same thing as you. And so it gives you that voice in the future direction of the research programme. And it's a showcase for your capabilities. So absolutely, UK participation is welcome by Jaap Gebrad for this. Next slide. I'm galloping through some of this, as you can see. I don't expect you to read all of this. You can see, however, these are the calls for proposals that are going to be released this year and next year. So it's 185 million for waterborne transport here. So that's what the C5D5, so that's the cluster, the destination, waterborne transport. And we have a whole host of things there, such as innovative onboard energy saving solutions, computational tools for shipbuilding, seamless safe logistics through autonomous freight feeders. So there's a whole host there, I would think, at least one of those which should interest a lot of this community. Next slide. And there's a couple that are part of the other destination, the destination 6. One's about controlling infection on large passenger ships, very topical, and another one about inland waterways, which I don't know we have a great deal of, but it's something that we can certainly grow. So next slide. Basically, if you're interested in getting involved in research and innovation collaboratively with European organisations similar to yourselves, please get in touch and I can explain exactly how we can do this and put you in touch with some people across Europe already that are doing this.
Great, thanks very much, Louise. And we'll make sure those slides go around to people. But the important takeaway message is the deal means that nothing changes for the UK's point of view. We can participate and access this significant funding and continue to work with those across Europe and beyond who are party to the programme on these big issues that affect us. So thanks very much, Louise. We'll again come to questions at the end. Allie, we're going to come to you now to talk a little bit about what happens now that we've had this first, this albeit thin, this first deal agreed. Where are we next? And any reflections from what you've heard? I know you've been on a couple of calls at the same time. You've got to dart off fairly quickly, but any reflections on what you've heard so far in terms of where we need to be in terms of negotiations now would be really, really useful to hear. So over to you.
Great, thanks. And I apologies to everyone. I didn't mention this to Ben. I think because I have, as Ben mentioned, I am trying to do multiple calls and webinars, including a boiler delivery group at the moment, and we've got a meeting with Cabinet Office in about half an hour. So for that reason, I'm not going to be on camera because I want to read a couple of things out. So apologies in advance, but I will switch my camera back on for when I can take any questions. So apologies on my behalf. I hadn't intended to do that, but my laptop is currently being used to record those other meetings for that purpose. So just briefly, I mean, I was intrigued to hear, and hello from Washington, by the way, there's been quite a few things going on this side of the pond in the last 24 hours as well, occupying our attention. There's a couple of things I probably wanted to reflect back on, and a number of the speakers, I think, made clear in talking about what the provisions are, particularly, but not limited to, around services provisions, the fact that this is really sort of not necessarily the end, perhaps the end of the beginning of that stage of negotiations. It's interesting to actually watch polemically the UK and the EU, what they have to say in this space, because I don't think you're getting that much transparency about the fact that this is effectively a new starting point rather than the end of Brexit writ large, that both sides really wanted it to be seen to be symbolically moving on from. And I think that actually one of the other speakers made a good point around transparency in terms of the architecture of who is going to be taking these, the sort of future cooperation that has to arise out of these kind of what I would still call a baseline agreement forward. And so we're hoping that, you know, DIT is going to have a huge amount of work to do unless that responsibility is going to be split across different departments. It was Cabinet Office, a lot of things regarding to the negotiations were reserved to the Cabinet Office. But if I can just sort of, let's briefly sort of summarize the architecture of the agreement, just to sort of give an idea about what the future short and medium term might hold. I mean, the TCA, the agreement, is only one part, albeit the central part of the overall package of agreements reached on December 24th. And there's a bunch of other supplementary agreements. So the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, agreement on security procedures for exchanging classified information, and then a whole range of joint declarations on different issues where further cooperation is foreseen, whether because, quite frankly, the negotiators ran out of time, or also in areas where they decided not to make it part of the agreement. And that's sort of obviously in financial services, regulatory cooperation, subsidies, hauliers, and the declaration of adequacy decisions. So we've got the FTA itself, and the Commission at least identifies these 4 areas of cooperation. The FTA, broad economic, social, environmental cooperation in areas that I think both clearly were only limited to mutual interest. I tend to define that as where the EU tends to see its interest going forward. Road transport, aviation, energy, climate change, fishing, and funding programs, as they've been referred to as well. And then a governance framework that includes this sort of hierarchy of oversight bodies and dispute provisions, including an arbitration tribunal. And I think George's point was very important there to reflect on that, you know, for all of the noise around the level playing field provisions, for all of the noise around, you know, what the UK and EU were sort of going to be bound into going forward, forward on the LPF provisions, actually, in order to not necessarily trigger those for different reasons, the UK doesn't want to attract tariffs, and I think the EU doesn't necessarily want to bring a dispute that it might lose. And so you could see, unless both sides, and I think pressured, quite frankly, by industry to be very careful in sparing their use of them, a default back to the lack of constraints around the use of trade remedy measures, because that's where sort of, you could start out with a few tariffs, but they could become quite, in terms of retaliation or defensive measures, safeguard measures, they could be quite long lasting rather than sort of temporary measures. So in terms of the institutional arrangements of the TCA, you've got the Partnership Council, the EU and the UK co-chairs at a ministerial level to oversee the attainment of the agreement's objectives and facilitate the implementation. The Partnership Council, I think, will vary depending on the issues at hand, whether it's a transport minister for transport issues, trade minister for trade issues, etc. And this may be, without having seen any of this really put into action yet, an idealistic interpretation of it. But the way I tend to look at it is, every so often, apart from the big EU summits during the year, you would also have the Council of Ministers meeting, whether it was on the Competitiveness Council, on transport, sort of the General Affairs Council, foreign policy, etc. And so that's sort of how I like to think about the Partnership Council, the overarching one. And then you've got a Trade Partnership Committee, which assists the Partnership Council and supervises the work of all these different, I think there's about 10 trade specialized committees and 8 specialized committees that focus on specific areas of competence, and more committees may be established. I think someone referred to this as a rather Byzantine web, was the description I saw quoted, for sort of looking at how this cooperation is going to be taken forward. So the bureaucrats are going to be very, very busy, and how industry sort of is brought into that is very, very important if we want to make proper use of this agreement, rather than, which is my fear, I think, of letting businesses feel that it's just easier not to use the agreement. It's too complex to use, and they'll just default to as if there had been no agreement to begin with, particularly in the areas that aren't covered in any comprehensive measure beyond tariffs. And then you've got 4 working groups, that are each relevant under the supervision of different trade specialized committees, probably more working groups to be foreseen. And then finally, a parliamentary partnership assembly may be established if the different UK and EU parliaments want it, as a sort of a forum for kind of exchanging views on the arrangements with pretty limited powers. If any of you know Bill Cash, I'm sure he will be chomping at the bit to be part of this. He's very big in any direction on sort of interparliamentary cooperation and engagement. It's not really clear yet at last I looked, and this is how, I think there's pressure being applied externally, of course internally, but externally by industry on government to really come up with clarity about how this is being taken forward. It's not clear yet, last I looked, how often each committee will meet or where, but they have to meet at least once a year. And I don't think that that's probably as sufficient as industry would particularly like. There is obviously a division of responsibilities in different areas between whether you take forward further cooperation under the EU agreement, EU aegis, or you actually do it sort of bilaterally with member states. And I think while there are obviously provisions, let's say around mutual recognition of professional qualifications, that the EU is not going to want to sort of lapse back to member states. There are other areas, for example, and I think we'll particularly see this as travel and trade really starts to pick up, if and when the vaccine is properly rolled out and businesses want to get back to sort of regular short-term travel for work and beyond purposes. So I think that's going to be an area of interest for bilateral engagement with the member states in the UK, but really, we want to make sure that, for example, I was looking at how often the committee set up under the EU-Canada CETA deal has met with respect to professional qualifications, and I think they've only had their second meeting this past November. So that's not what we want to see if we want to take this forward. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of pressure that needs to be consistently applied to the government to really take this forward and be transparent about it. The agreement also creates a sort of obligation for the EU and the UK to consult domestic advisory groups and civil society orgs. And that's a bit like sometimes I think what you get, probably the most I saw it, even though the agreement was never concluded, between the EU and the US on TTIP. That was a big, I think because of the sensitivity of it, that was a big accompanying sort of point to the negotiations. But the agreement says the EU and the UK have to promote interaction between their different domestic advisory groups. And that's going to be, I think, where industry itself, sectoral bodies especially, are going to be really important in taking some of this forward. I don't want to spend too much time on the dispute resolution process, to say that I think that that's going to be something that particularly, without wishing to speak entirely for manufacturing, is going to be a lot of key interest, because that's where you could see any sort of safeguard measures potentially being applied. Different provisions themselves, in terms of the core trade elements, it's interesting to hear the reference to professional services, and I think transport services is one of those kind of I wouldn't call it grey, but potentially going to be more grey mixed areas going forward about where the responsibility, the divvying up of the cooperation between regulatory authorities of the UK and respective European countries are involved. I think that's going to be particularly key for Ireland in particular. I mean, customs, while itself is a competence of the EU, the cooperation, I would argue, is a more sort of mixed competence. So there's going to be a sort of split, I think, in how much gets done between the UK and the EU under the architecture of the agreement, and then all of the work that has to go on to sort of fill in the gaps, so to speak. And one of the things that we've found talking to our members is, in terms of how they're no longer planning but trying to adjust to this, if you were just to take, for example, some of the services provisions, the reservations are there, they're locked in. I don't think we're going to see that much more negotiation on that sort of kind of detail, simply because that only gets done really under the confines of a proper trade agreement. But in terms of actually how that's sort of implemented, sometimes in different countries you can have what we like to call in the States sub-federal, municipal, council level sort of differences, discrepancies in regulations. And that's where I think the trying to mitigate against the loss of the impact of freedom of establishment for companies, and trying to understand in the difference between what the text says and what the guidance says, and what the guidance from the member states and below says, and then actually in practice what the regulatory authorities are going to expect you to do. And I think this is why that we've made such a push for businesses, not only I think in sort of maritime and sort of goods related sectors, but across the piece, to make sure that they are in touch with the customs and regulatory authorities at all levels where they engage with, because that's the best way, I think, to understand or try and mitigate sort of unexpected, unpleasant surprises after the fact. You'll know, you can't guarantee it, but the easiest way in which I tend to give an analogy is my passport was sort of chewed up by my dog, and while I need to go back to the UK at some point in the next few weeks, and while I know in practice what it says I'm entitled to do, I want to make sure that I'm going to go and speak to, and I've done this before, I'm going to call Heathrow and speak to them so that I understand exactly in practice. They know who I am, I've registered my interest, so it won't be an unpleasant surprise. I know what to expect, they know what to expect. And that's a perhaps strange kind of allegory to try and explain how we're trying to encourage industry to make sure that they are not just reading the text, reading the guidance, but actually going out and doing what I would call proactive due diligence with those various different authorities. I think I might stop there for now, because I've got to shoot off to this meeting on the protocol in about 8 minutes, and I will turn my camera back on for any questions. But again, this is really a baseline agreement. I think the challenge is to try and get the EU and the UK to be as transparent as possible in how they're going to take these different the work of this different specialised committees forward.
Thanks very much, Allie. I think the message there will be obviously sharing more detail with companies over some of this in the coming days and weeks. But the key message there is, despite what politicians might say on the television about Brexit being done and we can move on, is that there's going to be a huge amount of work for all of us on this call, individual companies, to not only get to grips with the arrangements, but also keep involved, as you say, with shaping and playing a role in these committees as we go forward through the new arrangement and the new context that we have. I mean, I'm very conscious you have to go, and there's I don't think there's a specific question that on what you've spoken about there. If there is, we'll get in touch afterward. But just my one question, I think, just to what we can take from what you've said, and we'll obviously let you head off to your meeting with Michael Gove, is what is it that you talk about sector bodies and industries, what would you say our collective priority should be at this point to ensure that the companies we're trying to support and represent through this are best served as we go forward?
I think it's probably twofold in different directions. The hope that the UK and the EU are going to embark on once there was an agreement, joint guidance, doesn't seem to have come to pass. And that's the most frustrating part, is that each side is basically effectively only designate itself as responsible for its own rules, and the lack of clarity with all this complexity about, well, I know what the government's approach to inbound imports and borders is going to be, but we only have limited guidance on what from the government, what the EU is saying, and we're trying to cut down on the amount of sort of duplicated but slightly different guidance that industry has to deal with. And I think I would say, the pressure really needs to be put on government to come up with clear plans for not only who within government is going to be responsible for implementing some of this kind of cooperation work. There seems to be I'll probably ask it again in 5 minutes. You know, the sort of various meetings that we've had with Canada Office, we keep asking this question and keep being told that sort of the work is underway. But, you know, even on something like, for example, agri-food provisions, it was notable that in an earlier meeting, I definitely heard a cabinet official refer to the fact that the agri-food controls, which I think a lot of industry were A, disappointed with the extent of them, and B, were hoping would change. There was definitely a remark I heard saying that basically this isn't, you know, this is the life to get used to. And so really need to press government for, you know, who's going to be responsible for the areas where there is future cooperation? What are the objectives for government in this space? Because otherwise I feel that there's going to be so much overwhelming business now that perhaps government just feels that they can get on with that work themselves at their own pace, when in fact we want to make clear that not only is the implication that it's a baseline agreement, but we actually want to start implementing it transparently, so that there is a provision for the sectoral bodies to know where they slot in. It was the last thing I would say on that is it was quite frustrating, I found. And there was a difference in administrations, to be perfectly honest. You know, in the run-up to various Brexit no-deal dates in 2019, there were lots of working groups going on within the business department, for example, on rules of origin, and those seemed to go completely quiet during the negotiation. This time around, we can't really have that. You know, now that this sort of whole with a Brexit question and with our how to Brexit question is over, we need to make sure that actually that the government is being pressured to put forward what its plans for how it wants to implement this cooperation provisions, and not just have it be a static agreement by default.
Great. No, thanks again, Allie. And I think there's a clear message for us, and I think it's about finding common cause for those of us in these sorts of roles to apply that pressure in a way that is compelling to ensure that the companies we all exist to support are best served. So thanks very much for joining us, and hope the meeting goes well. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Wonderful. Well, we've got a lot of questions that are here. I think what we'll try and do is group them and take them as best we can now. And then what we will do, as I'll mention in a moment, there's a series of regular engagement meetings with government, which we'll feed all these questions into if we're not able to answer them ourselves. But first off, George, I wanted to come to you on, there's quite a few questions around rules of origin. I wonder whether you could just give a bit of an overview, an introduction, and explainer as to what rules of origin are, and then pick up some of those specific questions that have been asked, if that's possible.
Sure, thanks, Ben. So the wonderful world of rules of origin. Rules of origin are really designed to ensure that a product that is using a preferential agreement, a preferential trade arrangement, deserve to use it. So it's to stop products coming in from other countries taking advantage or unfair advantage of the agreement. So what it's saying is that, you know, a product has to come from the UK in order to use that preferential tariff when it's transported into the EU, and vice versa. There are a number of different ways that this can be done in terms of what are the rules to say it actually comes from the UK. And if people go on to the government gov.uk, there's a 34-page bit of guidance around rules of origin specifically, and sort of looking at this in more detail. But there's different categories whereby if you're talking about a wholly originating product, so this is, you know, say potatoes are grown here in the UK, say a cow is reared, or, you know, timber, those type of things that, you know, are quite easy to say, no, this is definitely from the UK. That's one set of rules. For advanced manufacturing, these rules become somewhat more complex, and it's based on the value and quantity of products that are inputted into that manufacturing process, and then also the degree to which it is economically transformed through the manufacturing process. So depending on which product we're talking about, those rules can be somewhat different. And then for really complex products like cars, for example, there are in the agreement what are called product-specific rules of origin, so setting out in even more detail how a product can satisfy those rules of origin. Now, in terms of how do you prove that at the border, for the next 12 months, there are facilitations that have been put in place where companies don't necessarily need to have all of the paperwork to hand in order to qualify for those preferential tariffs, although they will need to satisfy those origin rules further on down the line. But there is some leeway in the coming months ahead as they get ready. And there are two ways that you can do this. Either it's the exporter who provides a statement of origin, and this is done both through a combination of commercial invoicing and unilateral statements by the exporter, or it can be done on behalf of the importer where they have sufficient knowledge of where the products are coming from. So it's really about that relationship between the customer and the buyer as to who will provide this documentation going forward, but that's really the idea behind these new rules of origin, and it's really around making sure that products are able to be used appropriately when qualifying for it. I noticed there was one question just around products coming in from Japan. So there is a UK-Japan trade agreement that replaces the EU-Japan EPA. When it's coming into the UK solely, and the UK is the end destination, then it would use the provisions set out in the UK-Japan agreement. If it's coming into the UK for onward shipping, then it's not necessary for rules of origin to qualify. It would be another customs procedure like a bonded warehouse or inward processing that would be used for that product to then re-export it. So it really depends on where that end use of the product is as to which rules it would seek to use.
Great, thanks for that, George. It's quite a it's one of these phrases that you hear banded around, and it's useful to hear an example like that as well to try and drill into it. I think what we'd advise all people joining here is just to get in contact with your MUK association to explore this in more detail. But it's useful to have a sort of a high level overview of this as well. There's quite a few questions here around people issues around seafarer certification, and I know from discussions I've had with the Department for Transport, they're quite positive and quite optimistic about how quickly they'll be able to get this the mutual recognition or certification on a bilateral basis. And there was a sense that we heard from UK negotiators that there was just a brick wall policy of talking about any issues until a deal was done to focus minds, I think, and you seem to hear that elsewhere. So that sounds positive. I don't think necessarily anybody on this call has any more information on how long that is likely to take, that process, but it's certainly something that is on the agenda, is on the table. We have a meeting as a collective with each of the industries represented tomorrow with government to go through in a sit-rep kind of sense how things are going and which issues are yet to be clarified, and that will certainly be there. But it's certainly something that's understood and clarity being sought on. But I don't think any of us necessarily have got any further detail than that on when we're likely to see the resolution of that issue, particularly on seafarer certification. Looking through the other questions that we've got here, there's a few issues which are more broad than the EU-UK deal, and the good thing about where we are now is we can take, so John Shudley's question, for instance, we can take that away and talk to the regional cluster down in the southwest. We can talk to the Skills Commission and so on. So we'll take those issues away and explore them. I've got a question. I think if we come to this at this point, which is I wondered if everyone could tell us what they think of their biggest challenge and opportunity for the sector from this deal. And I think if we come to sort of maritime people first, and then George, I'd like, if possible, you start to think about quite a few people who've been talking, and certainly those of us who were on a call last night with the PM and the business secretary. There was a lot of talk around, now that we have this flexibility, we can go in a different direction, we can diverge. just what your hunch is, your expectation is for how that work may happen, whether it's something that there's substance to, because clearly in a news media sense, we understand there's a suggestion when there's divergence in one area, there's going to be retaliations in another. It'd be useful to come to you just from an economy-wide point in a moment to see how people are starting to think that through, if you're aware, because the call that was picked up in the paper last night said PM issues challenge to businesses to come forward and let us know where we can diverge. And I'd just be interested to see if you've picked anything up on how people are starting to approach that challenge. But first off, let's come to Jeffrey. You may want to also pick up on some of the questions on phishing. I know you've been involved with a lot of this through your work in the House of Lords, but if you could pick up on Debbie's question on phishing perhaps, and then also what you see as the biggest challenge in the short term and also opportunity from the deal we have.
Thanks very much, Ben. So Debbie, phishing, I've found out following the fisheries bill, it's an incredibly complicated area, as you may know. And the magic, the sort of key defining point in this is 10-meter boats. And a lot of the vessels over 10 meters, the bigger vessels, were purchased by EU companies. I think, if I remember, particularly Spanish and possibly some Dutch, but particularly Spanish interests. And to the extent that the agreement gives a larger share of the catch to British interests, I think the government has introduced a higher crewing requirement on some of the, for those vessels, so that, they're not coming in through the back door, because these vessels were bought because actually, well, between ourselves, we're honest, the EU's fishery policy in those days was so dire that our sector was very depleted, and the ships, I think, were probably purchased quite cheaply. But, the government doesn't want therefore EU-owned vessels that nominally, where EU interest took over British businesses, to get British share of the catch that's now been increased through the back door. But there may be somebody who knows a lot more than me, but that would be from something I saw last week, I think that's probably what's behind it, Debbie.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Oh, yes, and sorry, and the second part of your question, Ben, yes, sort of challenge and opportunity. So I think, to answer it slightly differently, inevitably, I think my concern in the immediate term is where we have these regulated sectors, that sort of the city's interests aren't pushed back. I mentioned freight futures. The clearing houses, as you know, their remit was extended for 6 months. It's up for agreement where it will go. An enormous amount of European business is cleared through the London clearing houses. It's very important that we retain that position, because otherwise it's going to make it very difficult for example, major British ship broking businesses who transact a very considerable amount of freight derivative business, sort of futures for dry and wet, and for dry cargo and tankers and so on. And also, I don't want to see more European businesses relocating out of the LSE. So that whole area is an area of concern for me. I hope that we can come to satisfactory agreements on it. In terms of the opportunity, because ours is such an international business, and you can pick up the phone on the professional services and really help somebody anywhere in the world. I think that geographically an area of great importance for us, of great potential, is Latin America. But I think that, you hear a lot from the government and politicians about the Pacific, but, I think the psyche of Pacific economies, they don't automatically think of imported goods. They want to export everything over here and then, produce things themselves there. So I think there's a big potential in Latin America. The other thing, which I think is harder to define, but I think, we're now at a point where we have to make a success of this. We're sort of on our own. We can't sort of say that, well, we're part of the EU, we can't do this, we can't do that. We have to address every opportunity now. So I think that there is a genuine opportunity in terms of upgrading. The UK performs well when it's under pressure. It may take us a while to get going. I don't expect this to happen straight away, but I think it's a great opportunity for sort of working smarter, I think we have to do, and raising our goals. It's something we will do, we have to do. I'm pretty confident, well, I am confident we'll do it. And I think it will be quite a challenge, but all of us, we all hear about how the long hours of British workers work. Well, that's not actually right. We should be working a sensible amount of hours and working smarter. We have to move into a new place. All of us look at how we do things, our businesses, ourselves as individuals, start doing them a whole lot better. So I think this kind of, if I may call it, kick up the backside thing is going to be a great opportunity if we address it and embrace it and do things. We can find productivity and a lot of our other issues really moving forward rapidly.
Okay, thanks very much. Any change provides an opportunity for us to consider how we respond to it, I think is certainly true to say. So, and again, thanks for your positivity there. I just wonder whether, Iain, you wanted to just pick up on this. There was a question. We can see how important the issue of certification and people is for our attendees today and for the sector. I just wonder whether you want to pick up on any of those questions that are there. Anything that we can't answer today, we'll take away and we'll publish a little Q&A afterwards. But anything you'd like to take there, and then you too, if you'd be able to put your challenge and opportunity to us as well.
Yep. Okay. There's some complexity, as I said in my short piece. I think Debbie's talking particularly about COCs, and in the call yesterday, it was the People and Skills Forum meeting, Ajit Jacob from the MCA. He was able to name some countries, privately and formally, that have already registered with EMSA to say, yes, we're going to recognise UK COCs. None of the EU member states were ready to get it stuck into that process until after the agreement was signed. Christmas in the meantime, they're just getting round to it. Probably it's just a matter of a week or two. Ajit wasn't expecting any difficulties. So I think that's okay, Debbie, should be, and should be hearing positive news throughout fairly quickly. Kerry Workboat Association is asking a much more complex question, which isn't covered, about temporary visa arrangements and the rest of it. And I think that second question is about that too. A question newly posted. I'd be interested to get a comment from George actually about process, on the basis that there's clearly some particular things which Workboat Association, for example, and others have some very particular questions which don't appear to have been covered in the agreement because a lot was sorted at quite short notice. And for example, somebody coming into the UK for a 4-week assignment who may well not step foot in Britain at all, or perhaps only for into an airport and then off out to sea, is in a very different position to somebody who is looking to come and stay here, work here for 2 years, 5 years, whatever. And that doesn't appear to be covered. I wonder whether, George, you can say anything about the wider process. I mean, Allie was using the language of baseline agreement. Was there anything agreed on process terms about how the two parties could pile into the detail again? I'll leave you to comment in that in a minute. My challenges and opportunities. Challenges, I think, are in the short term. Companies getting their heads around the new rules around recruitment and employment. Typically complex stuff, particularly when you're recruiting from overseas. It's all manageable when you've got somebody who's got the time to go through it and work through the detail. And the kind of example that Allie gave with the dog eating her passport, it's what do the rules say, and then what do they actually mean, and what do they mean in practice? And whether you don't want to no company wants to get stuck on the basis that, well, they kind of gave us a nod and a wink last time. I mean, thinking of the difficulties in Capitol Hill last night, when my wife and I visited 18 months ago, nod and a wink. My wife didn't have a passport. She showed an Oyster card from Transport for London, not a problem. And we got in. But you can't build a business on that kind of basis. So we need some certainty. And I think in the short term, there's getting your head around all that kind of stuff so that people are comfortable and we've got a new equilibrium. For the longer term, the opportunity, but then there's some risk in it, the opportunity is to grab that chance to invest more in homegrown talent. But some of the difficulties that John referred to in his comment, you know, those opportunities have been there forever. I mean, all the way through my career, all the way through yours, John. It's not that we've been stopped from doing it. And then, you know, taking Jeffrey's words, I'm not sure that we're going to quite get the kick up the backside that's going to ensure that people will move forward, because people are in the maritime sector terrifically good at finding workarounds. I mean, and something that causes you to step back and say, okay, the game's changed. Let's grab this opportunity to rethink the way we do things and to shift from short-term taking on a poll at short notice if we've got a gap to fill, to investing for the long term in graduate recruits, apprentices and the rest of it. I don't know. I think that's a challenge for the likes of you and me, John, in different organisations to try and get people to think differently. Maybe George, pick up the point I pushed in your direction, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, George.
Sure. So on the visa question, and I think that it's important in the terms of the free trade agreement, everything that it talks about is short-term provision of services. So there's nothing in the agreement that covers residency. There's nothing in the agreement that talks about naturalization rights for nationals. What that has become for the UK is the new points-based immigration system rather than the free movement that there was before. So just in terms of that distinguishing point around what's part of a trade deal and what's not, in terms of what is part of the trade deal, it sets out the elements that and activities that are allowed under the business visitor definition, which is quite limited in scope and normally doesn't provide for the provision of paid services, and is very, limited to attending an internal meeting, attending a conference, attending a bit of training. Those types of activities will be considered as not needing a work visa for travel for when you're going into the EU for business purposes. One thing that we should say, and this is where it becomes slightly complicated in the application of the agreement, is every member state is able to be more liberal if they so want. So you've seen already, say, Germany for tech entrepreneurs operates a more liberal business visitor regime because it wants to attract that inbound talent. So it's really up to, it's really a case where you have to look at the individual rules in each member state when looking to travel there for business purposes. And that's one of the reasons why the complexity around the provision of services does get so high and so hard so quickly, is because each member state operates a slightly different regime but on these sorts of areas. So apologies for not being able to give a hard and fast answer, because depending on what service, what you want to do there and where you're going, all gives a slightly different answer.
Thanks, George. And just whilst you're there, as our sort of trade whiz kid, I'm one on the question around conformity assessments. It says here, your understanding that wasn't agreed, that wasn't in you, yeah.
So there was no annex on mutual recognition of conformity assessments agreed as part of the deal, which for many manufacturers was a huge blow, because there was an expectation that would have been agreed. And indeed, the EU has a number of conformity assessment agreements in place with countries around the world. So yeah, it's one of those areas that I think is ripe for future discussions, but unfortunately not included as in this iteration of the deal.
Okay, thanks very much. Matthew, if we come to you, just that question around short-term, medium-term challenge versus opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I'll just back up George, to be honest, and that sort of uncertainty regarding visas and the way that they're going to be treated. Again, you have to be very careful about what is and what is not included in the deal, and then when you're thinking about how you're going to comment on these things, bearing in mind what the UK government has in its own competency and how that relates to the government. So I think there's always needs to be a bit of care taken in those discussions. Challenge first. I think one of the problems that we identified even at a very long time ago in terms of Theresa May's deal was that we thought that in Jeffrey's parlance, the bid-offer spread was too wide at the start, and we didn't think they were so close enough to come up with a deal that would really provide many of the benefits that we had aspired to in our position papers in 2017. Obviously, as Allie also said, the agreement really is a framework for further discussions. So the biggest challenge for us really is to try and ensure that within those future discussions, our voice is heard, that the interests of our industry are fully appreciated and included. And as I mentioned before, it's been quite difficult at times in terms of engagement with DIT and DEXU in terms of getting various messages across and for them to take the interests of our industry suitably seriously. And I think that is going to be an ongoing piece of work as discussions continue. In terms of opportunities, I actually always go back to something that John Major said on Andrew Marr on the Sunday before the referendum. And one of his arguments for Remain was that the whole Brexit process would consume government. It would reduce government capacity to look at other things that we might want to develop and improve about UK PLC. And I think looking back at the last 4 years, I think to an extent he was right. So as an example, in our immediate work, DfT have recently suspended their work on inclusive transport, for instance, which we think is a bit disappointing. We think there's a lot of benefit for that work. It's not DfT's fault, it's just a simple lack of capacity. Working both on the twin challenges of Brexit and COVID means they haven't been able to do that. Hopefully now that some of the Brexit question has been answered, there can be that return of capacity in the civil servants, and they can start really looking at a lot of the issues that really can generate growth and improve the UK maritime economy. So as I said, future borders, future freight, and things like the inclusive maritime transport strategy, obviously clean maritime plan, all of these things could really do with that boost in capacity that the government maybe has struggled with in recent years. And we look forward to working with the government in advancing those interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Louise, it might be a bit harsh for me to ask you the biggest opportunity of moving away from your organisation that you spend a lot of time with, or the community that you've been working very closely with, but in reality, a lot of that's not changing because of what you've spoken about in terms of the agreement and the deal that's in place. But it's only right to extend that to you as well.
Well, yes, thanks. I mean, there is actually a greater opportunity here, coincidentally, if you like, rather than specifically around our situation, but coincidentally, this is the first time that Horizon framework programs have had a specific maritime partnership. So that hasn't happened before. We tried getting one off the ground during the Horizon 2020, and we missed the boat. So we've got that now. So we have actually dedicated funding from the EU specifically for the maritime sector. It's an opportunity that we ought to be grasping as we can. The opportunity is not really just the funding, because yes, funding is always welcome, but it's the additional benefits of the collaboration, the benchmarking that you can do by getting involved in research innovation projects with international participants, because Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe are open to the world. So it's not just European organisations that get involved. I've been in projects that have had Canadian, Japanese, American, Russian involvement, and that will happen throughout Horizon Europe. So it is an opportunity to build those collaborative networks. If you collaborate with somebody on a research project to develop the next generation of systems and solutions, these people tend to be your partners in selling those things onwards. They have customers and they have suppliers, and building that bigger connecting network is very valuable. Clearly the challenge is around demonstrating our value again back into those programs. We're not just an automatic shoe-in from being a member state. We have to be demonstrating that we're adding value when we join those consortia. But that shouldn't be a problem. I've got a lot of confidence in our capabilities to do that, and I'm there to help.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Louise. It was, I think that last point in particular is one that we all need to be mindful of a little bit when we look to things like Shipping Week and these other opportunities we've got. How we present ourselves and the way that we seek to partner with people is even more important, and there's a strong message to send there. So thank you. Conscious of time, I think we've done our best to answer questions that we've got there in the Q&As, but there's clearly, this is, I think Ali said it's the end of the beginning, which means there's clearly a lot more work to do, a lot more depth to be explored, and we'll need to all be on top of this. But before we get to that last slide, George, I flagged something. I wondered whether it's a bit of a rambling question, but there's been a lot of talk, I think, often quite chatty talk, which is sort of saying, well, once we've left the EU, the opportunity to do things differently in a regulatory space or otherwise. What's your, now this is a sector that's got various things like the port services regulation, and there's areas where on the business environment that we want to create in the UK to attract ship ownership managers, other maritime businesses to the UK. There's people are chomping at the bit a little bit with ideas and proposals. How do you see that work unfolding? I guess it's stuff that you'll be working with your clients on to see or to make the case potentially for the UK if that then happens. How do you see that unfolding in terms of balancing that the opportunity with the risk that there might be, because the retaliation that any divergence might result in? How do you see that all unfolding?
So I think there's really three pressures at the moment, and sort of if we take them in turn, and I will be quite conscious of time. The first is from the business perspective, that yes, there may be regulations that they're not exactly happy with and slightly grumpy about, but we are in a moment of unprecedented change for many British businesses, both that combination of COVID and the change in trading relationship with our closest and largest trading partner means that that I think the appetite for additional change at the moment is something that they're a little bit skeptical of. I think there is a sense among many of the clients that I talk to that they want to get used to this new normal before starting to think about what potential future changes could come about. The second pressure, and I think this was raised through a number of the presentations, is the increasing rise of both and importance of sustainability. That's not going to stop. It's impacting across all different sectors, whether you're talking about decarbonisation in the maritime sector, as has been mentioned, or if we're talking about climate and disaster related financial reporting requirements that are coming through in the financial services sector. We're seeing new transparency and other regulations coming in, like the deforestation legislation and other such tropical supply chain mandatory reporting requirements. So it's quite a complex area that companies are having to get behind and make changes to how they do business. I think it's going to cost money in the short term, but ultimately will lead to better and more efficient business practices on the whole, in addition to doing the right thing for the planet and avoiding some of the disasters that could potentially occur. So I think that's definitely driving a lot of change, and that's going to accelerate over the coming years. And then the third push, I think, is really going to be picking up on something that Matt said, which is around getting back to the domestic agenda. I think, we need to revisit what does a reformed industrial strategy look like. And, that's certainly been something that many of our clients have been pushing government on. what does a more effective apprenticeship scheme look like? How do we ensure that the skills are being taught at university that's actually needed by all of the different industries that are developing here in the UK? All of those sorts of questions have taken a backseat over the last 4 years. And I think now is the opportunity to really refocus on them, because ultimately that's how you build competitiveness, and that's how you really sell your products overseas, is having the most competitive product and services to offer the world.
Thanks very much, George. I think that's I think it's useful to look at what the reality is of, or some the context in which some of these discussions are happening, and as you say, transparency and other such trends are going to potentially mean that our wriggle room to do things drastically different perhaps aren't going to be things we want to pursue in the short term or in a rash way. But just we're 1 minute to go. I just wanted to first of all thank all of our panelists for giving up their time for, it was a good session. Clearly, someone said, as I say, at the end of the beginning, I think we need to keep doing this sort of thing. I think if you've got specific technical regulatory queries, challenges, contact your Maritime UK member body or cluster, and we'll collectively do our best to support you. Just to let you know how we're all working together, tomorrow all parts of the sector come together with with government to provide a situation report on how it's going, to flag issues, gaps, opportunities, or areas that we need to prioritise for future agreement. I think the message we've heard from non-maritime colleagues on the call today is very much to keep focused, keep stuck in, keep engaged with this. And whilst on a political level, Brexit might be done from a narrative sense, there's a lot for us to remain plugged into to ensure that we can support the sector as best as possible. So thanks very much to everybody for joining. Thanks to all of our people who have joined in as a participant on the call too. And then one final thing is we've got an ask here. Not only do we want you all to keep in touch with what we're doing as a collective on the website and newsletters and so on, but last year we launched a industry ambassador scheme, which has been a lot of talk today about people and skills, and clearly the ambassador scheme is only one part of that big piece. But everybody on this call who has an interest or knowledge of the sector is ripe for going into schools and colleges to talk about our sector. There's a link, we'll send it round, sign up, and we can support you to take that maritime story to the next generation and make sure people are aware of what a cracking opportunity this sector can provide for them. So there's a little ask associated to some of the topics today, so please do have a look if you can. So thanks very much to everybody for joining. The start, by no means the end, and the important thing is we all work together to make this as the short term as clear and as easy for companies as possible, but then we remain plugged into the work that's happening, and we'll make that commitment to do so on your behalf. But your intelligence and insight and input is incredibly important to tell us how things are going in practice on the front line. So please do remain in contact with your member associations. Apart from that, thanks very much, and we're almost at the end of that first week. It feels like we've been back forever, but a hugely exciting year for many of us, and we look forward to working with you to make it as successful as possible. So thanks very much.